Good morning. I'm Nicole Flatow, editor at City Lab, where we cover the future of cities. Nothing looms larger in that future than how cities are handling climate change. By some estimates, cities consume over two-thirds of the world's energy and account for more than 70% of global CO2 emissions. They also, of course, account for a majority of the world's population and growing. So it's apt that we should look to cities for what role they're playing in combating climate change. I have a wonderful set of panelists today to help me tackle this question. I'm going to start with an introductory question to dig into some of these issues of where cities can make a difference. I'll start with Cristina Gamboa, who is the CEO for the World Green Building Council. Cristina, question for you. What are the low hanging fruit, the largest sources of emissions that cities could be affecting more, or changes that they could be making that would be most impactful, but some of them just aren't?
Yeah, thank you, Nicole. I'm very honored to be part of this Bloomberg Green Festival. Hello, everyone in this panel. So from the World Green Building Council, which is a global action network of around 70 green building councils, we're catalyzing the uptake of sustainable buildings for everyone, everywhere. Cities are holding so much potential for driving net zero carbon emissions and sustainability going forward. And I guess it's up to us to make it happen. So looking forward to the conversation. As you said, Nicole, the emissions in cities is outrageously high. And in that 70% buildings hold the bulk of those emissions. So the lowest hanging fruit relates to measures that reduce consumption and energy waste in buildings, which offer the fastest and most cost-effective way to unlock those carbon savings we desperately need. However, those are often overlooked and deprioritized because even though the technology is there and we have a responsible investment movement supporting sustainability worldwide, outrageously only 30% of cities in the world have energy performance codes for buildings. So without energy efficiency and bold regulation, cities will need much more renewable energy and infrastructure to meet any decarbonization goal. So the climate science is telling us that all new buildings should be built today to the best standards we know, and that is net zero carbon buildings, and we should push for a renovation wave. So existing buildings are refurbished to improve their energy performance, so we act on energy poverty, which is also a big social injustice around the world. Cities are acting and embracing this vision. We currently have 28 cities, 6 states and regions, and 66 businesses signed up to the net zero carbon buildings commitment. And this is sending a strong signal that cities and businesses want to decarbonize their portfolios using market-ready technologies.
Thank you, Cristina. Next, the same question to Paul Simpson, CEO of CDP.
Yeah, thanks, Nicole. It's a pleasure to be here. And at CDP, we run a global disclosure platform for all the world's companies, cities, states, and regions. And over 850 cities disclose through us on climate change annually. So, of course, I would say that every city should be measuring and disclosing on climate change and also setting a net zero science-based target. But when we analyze the disclosures from cities, we find two really interesting things. That firstly, cities who really understand the co-benefits of climate action, so that could be jobs, clean air, health, take more action, and on average 2.5 more times the action. So understand those co-benefits of your climate mitigation and resilience efforts. And secondly, conduct a risk and vulnerability assessment from the physical hazards and risks of a changing climate, because the cities that conduct those assessments and understand those risks take 6 times more action. So getting to really understand this drives the city to take more action.
Thanks, Paul. Next to Jessica Matthews, CEO and founder of Uncharted Power.
Thank you, Nicole. And yes, I must echo everyone who's gone before me. I'm very excited to be here and be on this panel. If you don't mind, I'm going to be a little bit cheeky here and take your question literally. What's the lowest hanging fruit? In my opinion, in the opinion of Uncharted, the company that I've been at the helm of now for almost a decade, we actually believe that the lowest hanging fruit is literally the lowest thing in a city, the ground. And it's actually very much often from a technology perspective and from a supply chain perspective, one of the most underutilized assets of any city. And so what we do at Uncharted Power is essentially develop sustainable infrastructure solutions that help make sure that we can actually get to a world where everyone on the planet lives in a sustainable, smart community. What's kind of very frustrating, I think, for I'm sure most of us here on this panel, many those who are here in attendance, and definitely those of us at Uncharted, is that most of the technologies that are necessary to live in a sustainable, smart world exist today. But then why is it that we just have these kind of one-off stories, these one-off success moments? And the reality is that even though we think we've been building smart cities, we actually have been building smart cities that aren't that smart. And it's because of the siloed development of infrastructure, critical infrastructure like power, broadband, even sidewalks and roads. And then attempting to have this siloed deployment of smart city solutions has resulted in something that's not economical to deploy, it's not economical to manage, and nor is it really economical to think about modularly scaling in any kind of rapid way. And so what we've done is we've created something called the Uncharted system. And it's a paver solution that really seeks to revolutionize the way that we think about our ground in cities. And it actually converts the ground beneath our feet and beneath our cars into a multi-use space for power delivery, data collection, third-party integration, and smart city applications as well. And it only requires 1 foot of trenching. So it really unlocks all of the opportunities you have in terms of edge data collection and edge data compute. And it's our hope that with these solutions, we're going to be able to actually, one, just make it easier to truly deploy sustainable smart cities, but also provide cities with the tools that they need to make this something that's economical in the long run. We're already estimating approximately 30 to 40% reduction in budget costs that would normally be expected when you have to sustain these types of communities. So we're very excited to add that kind of technological, market-ready perspective to this conversation.
Thank you, Jessica. Last, we go to Gregor Robertson, who has the challenge of being the last person to answer this question. Global ambassador for the Global Covenant of Mayors for Climate and Energy, as well as the former mayor of Vancouver. What's the low-hanging fruit?
Well, as a former mayor, I would say that the low-hanging fruit is really regulation, and in most cities, definitely not all cities, but in most cities, governments are elected to make decisions and to create the direction and the laws of the city. So there are opportunities for mayors and their councils to move forward, to implement, to regulate, to take action on climate that I believe will be well supported in many cities if that political courage is there. We have market solutions, and in most cases, we have market solutions to advance dramatically on climate action, both to mitigate and to adapt to changing climate. But I think it takes that political courage first and foremost. And literally, this is the stroke of the pen piece where our councils and mayors can take action and implement it at the city level, and not to let the national governments off the hook because they control far more resources. But I think if we can see action very quickly, it could come from our mayors and councils, and then that means it comes from the people. So if people are more strident or more forceful or more direct in advocating for climate action, their mayors and councils can deliver that readily, very quickly, and empower the private sector in particular to take action with market-based solutions as well.
Thanks a lot, Gregor. And thank you all for raising a lot of the key points that we can really dig into here. I'm going to start by going back to Paul to set up the data for us a little bit. We at Bloomberg love data, and you are collecting information on disclosures from cities in addition to companies. So we're asking on this panel whether climate neutrality is possible. Lots of cities have set goals to get there, some others haven't, as well as disclosures on how close they've gotten so far to meeting those goals. So can you give us the real talk? Do most cities' disclosures suggest that climate neutrality is achievable? And over what time horizon? What are you seeing that's most encouraging and least encouraging there?
Yeah, thanks, Nicole. And each year we analyse the disclosures and also share them with our partners like C40, ICLEI, the Global Covenant that Gregor is representing. The picture is mixed, if we're honest. I'd like to be more gung ho, but what we see is that very positively now, a lot of cities are disclosing, more than 850 cities, an increasing trend to set net zero targets. Most of those are for 2050, and that's understandable. It's in line with the science, and to change a city takes time. So 2050 is the most normal timeline for cities, and there are some very positive trends that so we're on our way to climate neutral net zero cities. Over 100 cities disclosing through CDP already are powered by more than 70% renewable energy, and 40 cities powered by 100% renewable energy. So that's one of the key elements. Cities have got to get their electricity to net zero, and already 40 have. So that's fantastic. We see twice as many cities since the Paris Agreement are setting emissions reduction targets, now up to 275 of those cities with those targets, and more cities adopting climate action plans, well over 300 now. So really positive momentum and trends that gives me a lot of hope. I think the caution is that 2/3 of the cities who are disclosing do not yet have a target that covers all of their community emissions. Yeah, cities are complex organisms, and it's not just the emissions of the city authority, but there's the emissions across the city. So there is a lot more to do. And what we see very excitingly is some cities now establishing partnerships to work with the businesses in the city. So there's a Cities of Business Alliance that we work with C40 and WBCSD on, because cities can't do this on their own. They need investment, they need partnership with the businesses, and of course they have to engage the citizens to live in the cities to also change their behaviour. So we see a positive pathway with a lot more to do.
That's great. Can you point to one or two cities that are closest to the goal that they set, and what might characterize that place?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I think so. Actually, interestingly, the country with the most cities with net zero targets is the United States, and Los Angeles and Seattle, two of the cities that are really progressing very well with their targets. In Sweden, there are 7 cities, including Stockholm, with a net zero target, and in the UK, 6 cities. So they're the geographies with the most cities with the targets. I think it's fair to say that every city is really on a journey. But one thing to look out for is where the city has more advanced targets than national governments. Gregor referred to, what the city can do and what the national government needs to do. So if we look at Manchester in the UK, has a net zero target for 2038, when the UK's target is 2050, and they're already putting a whole place of activities in to meet that target. So we're always looking for where is that ambition and is it being met? But the caution again is, no city has really solved this yet. So some great progress, still more to do.
Yep. Thanks a lot, Paul. So underlying that conversation we were just having is, of course, somewhat of an assumption that cities have full control or power to be able to affect their climate emissions, which we all know is not true entirely. Certainly, cities have become symbolic leaders in the fight against climate change. In the U.S., for example, mayors really took the lead when Donald Trump declined to sign the Paris Climate Accord, and a global network of mayors said they would commit to reach those goals to some of what we were just talking about. And there's been a number of sets of climate networks like that have been set up amongst city leaders, such as the one that Gregor oversees. But city officials only have so much power even within those networks, and only so much money. So Gregor, how much can we really expect to be achieved at the city level?
Well, yeah, it's a great question, and I think we can expect a lot more. As David just said, there's not that many cities who are at the forefront and the leading edge of taking action to deal with climate, and so many more can kick into gear. And we've created the systems. We have lots of tools, with Global Covenant of Mayors, C40, and various other organizations. There's a lot of technical support to do this. There is not enough financial support. So finance is a critical piece here, and that needs to flow more readily from our national governments, who have committed in Paris to 1.5 as our stretch target, but under 2 degrees is absolutely critical, as we know, to our survival. So we need to see national governments investing through cities And basically that's going to flow through to the private sector to implement a lot of this. Right now we have an extraordinary opportunity with stimulus funding to get the economy going in the wake of the global pandemic. So we've got an opportunity to do a green recovery, a green and just recovery, because a lot of this ties very directly to social justice and making sure that everyone benefits. But we do have a huge opportunity right now to make sure that the new infrastructure that we invest in is green infrastructure and that it helps transform our cities, decarbonize, and that investment has to come from the national governments. We have to have more leadership there. It doesn't matter how many mayors stand up and take action. If we don't see support from national governments, it's going to be a lot more difficult. It'll just take a lot longer to get there. But cities have made a start. We know where the path is, and we just need more support from the national governments as soon as possible.
Gregor, one role that these networks of city leaders have played is to lobby around this exact issue. Can you articulate how they've amplified the power of cities or failed to do so?
Well, I think the networks have really served a great function with technical support to cities, with some advocacy, and I think, as the Carbon Disclosure Project does, there's a lot of tracking of data now. 10 years ago, that didn't exist. I think the key thing now is that we keep evolving and make sure that we do have more connectivity with the private sector for market solutions. I think we've seen dramatic change now with transportation, with companies coming forward with zero-emission vehicles. We need to see faster progress with buildings. As Christine said, we've got huge, number one source of climate pollution is our buildings, in both embodied carbon and in our heating and cooling. We have to see market solutions coming faster on that front. So I think cities have made progress. The networks that support them need to keep stepping up, and we need to see the private sector and national governments do a lot more to support cities making this change on climate action.
Thanks, Gregor. Jessica, we're hearing a lot of references to the private sector as the representative on this panel. I'll turn to you here. You've been in the private sector working on renewable energy solutions, but one of your challenges, as you've articulated, is that finding government funding or other ways to pay for the needed infrastructure or to enact what's necessary to achieve that infrastructure has been a real challenge for you. How have you confronted that challenge?
We don't ask the cities to pay anymore. Quite frankly, I know this sounds kind of crazy, but at the end of the day, I feel very fortunate because I got into this space not really just looking at how one city is doing things, but having very much a duality of my life, spending half my time in Nigeria where my father lives and half my time in not even in the big cities, actually growing up in like the small cities that are representative of the United States, and having also family in Europe with a very different situation, right? And really saying, okay, well, there's so many differences in what's going well and what's not going well. I'm, to be honest, probably most excited about the smart city development, the sustainable infrastructure development in Europe and in Asia. But at the end of the day, there are some similarities. And one of them is that if you are relying on the municipality to fund the infrastructure, it will be slower. And if the municipality is left with very expensive solutions and having to figure out how to manage, it's already one thing to manage just what's already happening in government, but then to say, now let's manage this new layer of technological complications and integrations without giving them the appropriate solutions, you're kind of setting them up to fail. And so what we went into this kind of this challenge saying was, how do you ensure that cities have the critical infrastructure that they need without making it something that only cities that have the budget can do? And so we realized that the opportunity there was really looking at a platform model, right? And like any platform where multiple stakeholders come to play and there's streamlined convenience from the integration to actually then lend itself to reduced costs, but also there's synergistic value that's created so that there's new kinds of ways of thinking about funding. So for example, with the current city that we're working with, the idea is not to say, here's the cost of our system. It's to say, what's your current budget? Okay, well, we're going to see if we can cut your budget by 30 to 40%. And then we'll take a small fee from that. But that's not where we're going to get the majority of the funding, because for the utility scale renewable power providers, we're actually giving them real edge data on energy consumption. We're providing edge compute so they can have a more streamlined solution for actually getting their customers power. So now that's a way for us to finance this infrastructure as well. For the smart city applications, they're getting edge compute and cloud and co-location at the edge in a much more streamlined way. And then we're also able to actually look at the ground itself and say, well, what else can we do to finance this infrastructure? And so the idea seemed kind of crazy a few years ago, but I was like, well, if every single square block was a data center that generated revenue from just providing edge cloud and edge compute in the ground, essentially then we could actually help cities monetize their ground, and in exchange get all the necessary infrastructure that you need to have a sustainable smart community, the necessary power delivery, the necessary broadband, et cetera. And so our market solution really had to be triangular. We knew we could not just create technology in a vacuum. We had to consider the financing and the policies as well. And so to make sure the financing would be more streamlined, we really, really worked very hard over the last 4 years to cut the cost in a huge way. And so that's kind of my favorite thing, I think, about coming out to the world and being even in groups like this, because most technology providers are going to say, here's the bill for this great opportunity. And what we're going to say is, thank you for the opportunity to work with you. Now we want to partner to help you get more out of your city. And like any type of infrastructure that's critical in today's world, like all of the digital infrastructure we have with email and search and all of these different things, critical physical infrastructure should be free as well. And so that's how we're thinking about things right now. Kind of radical, I know. Don't charge the cities anything, but
no, very interesting.
Yeah, absolutely, Cristina. I have a separate question for you, but feel free to incorporate some more comments there. So turning to buildings again, in the past few years, there's been a recognition, as you alluded to in the first question, that even new buildings that meet the gold standard of energy efficiency, which of course many do not, can have significant adverse effects on carbon emissions because of the materials that go into making those buildings, such as manufacturing steel, for example, and the emissions that come just from that process. In light of this, how should we be approaching the question of building new but more sustainable buildings versus repurposing existing buildings, even if they weren't built to be energy efficient? How can we better work with the built environments we already have?
Okay, so I believe that our role is to make sure that industry is having the adequate information and skills to prioritize systematically low carbon choices. Some geographies in the world will need new infrastructure, Nicole, to house population, right? While others will need to address underperforming building stock that is holding us back from meeting the climate targets for this decade. So ideally, we should always evaluate whether the right choice for the environment is to build a new building or repurpose it, keeping in mind that we need to think about performance, as we were hearing from the panel. On the majority of cases, if you take a whole life approach, it will be better to renovate a building to the highest energy efficiency possible standards than to build a new one. But for this, we need incentives and policy. So we promote building renovation at scale and valuing carbon across the life cycle. And that's why this language of upfront emissions or embodied carbon is so critical, because really the most sustainable building is the one that is already built. It has already emitted carbon, as you say, from its construction. It will probably have a debt carbon still to pay when the buildings are around. So the industry to date is shifting to ensuring that buildings not only do less harm to our environment, and I guess that is also a behavioral shift, but also they need to perform at net zero while addressing upfront emissions or embodied carbon. So the best advice to tackle that issue that you were also mentioning, Gregor, is first and foremost, prevent. So always question the need for using new materials throughout and making the best at renovations and reuse. The second would be to reduce and optimize. Look at design approaches, construction techniques, material choices that lead to low and zero carbon. Many companies that in the past have been considered industry leaders and in the high to abate sectors are making also net zero commitments. So we are taking action, let's say, collectively, looking at the lens of whole life, and that brings more answers to that big question of the upfront emissions that already is there within the city.
Great. And I think you started to allude to this, but I just want to ask it a bit more overtly. Should part of the Green Building Council's role be to deter unnecessary construction and growth altogether?
No, I don't believe so. I think, as I said, we need to bring information and skills so each city decides its best trajectory. Some regions in the world are still urbanizing at a very high rate. And I think what I'm saying is that we need them to leapfrog and not go through the carbon intensive growth other cities have done, but probably as we're also hearing, getting innovative technologies that are already out there to provide the urban infrastructure and, let's say, the new communities in a different way than we've built before. And it doesn't mean that growing is bad, but it's questioning how and why, and always making this shift towards thinking low carbon and making it, let's say, from a policy perspective, a highest priority to track performance. And as we've seen, always having science-based targets to deliver on that vision.
Thank you. So we have a question here from the audience. It's kind of a big question. I think each of you have already offered some thoughts on this, but I'm going to throw it out there. How do you think we can overcome these legislative and bureaucratic issues that you've alluded to? How do we move forward on creating smart cities in spite of bureaucratic inertia? I think, Jessica, you offered one vision, which is the private sector might pay for some of it themselves. Do folks have other thoughts about answers that haven't already been given that perhaps empower, citizens more so and other actors who feel disempowered by the Gregor, I'll ask you first. Oh, I think you're on mute. Okay, we'll try someone else.
Yeah, maybe speaking from the political standpoint, people, it's great to see activism for equality and ending racism around the world right now. And we've seen enormous activism around climate from our youth in particular. People need to be vocal, and they need to be organized, and they need to keep pressure on mayors and councils and national leaders in particular for climate action that is just. So I think it starts with the people as everything does. But then, the piece around data and tracking and digital infrastructure, I think both Paul has spoken to this about CDP. Like if we don't have the numbers, if you can't hold people accountable and you're not tracking the numbers, it's very difficult to move a bureaucracy unless the numbers are crystal clear. So I think that data piece is really important, and certainly something that Mayor Mike Bloomberg used to say, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. Many mayors have taken that to heart, and we have a system now with accountability. But I think the key piece in our time right now is about investing in low carbon infrastructure, whether that's green buildings and retrofitting and renovating buildings. It's digital infrastructure that Jessica's talking about. Like, we have to make the leapfrog. We're going to be investing enormous dollars around the world to get the economy going, and it's got to be low carbon investments in the technology that will get us through into the future, the buildings, the transportation, the digital infrastructure that are critical for cities to grow and be low carbon.
Thanks. Jessica, in the little time we have left, you're someone who's been innovating new green technologies since you invented a soccer ball that can be used as a power generator at age 19, and have since been doing all kinds of other inventions. And you've encountered these obstacles that you alluded to in getting it funded, et cetera. What do you think both innovators and city leaders need to better understand about what's required to bring new technology to bear at scale, maybe some of the political lessons that you've learned?
I'm so happy you asked that question, because it's actually just what I was thinking as Gregor was speaking. Everything he said was 100% correct. And I think the way we facilitate this is that it's less about what either side needs to understand, and more about the frequency of facilitated collaboration. It is very, very difficult for the private sector, for technologists, innovators, for people who are excited to build and change the world, to understand how politics works, how municipal government works. Oh my, that's been a wonderful learning experience for me. And it's not intuitive. And there needs to be a bridge. And to whatever extent that we can create very direct, very consistent spaces for collaboration, for honest and open collaboration, to create those bridges, I think that's huge. That I'm really seeing right now that most people who I know who are, startup founders, when I tell them what I do, they immediately just start seeing red flags. Oh my gosh, but infrastructure is so scary and so slow. And so we have so many brilliant people who aren't even trying, if I'm being honest. And I think even just the space right now, the opportunity to even be on this panel with each of you, I'm quite excited. I will be emailing each of you. But it is actually truly something that I think will go very far. If you can even have in each city a special purpose area that's dedicated to trying out incredibly new things in very small but very real ways. If there's a way to do that with more frequency, I believe that the other side will do its part as well, and we'll see a real rapid development in creating solutions that are cost effective to deploy, in addition to also being sustainable for long-term use as well.
Yeah, well, we've run out of time, and that's a really wonderful note to end on. So I know there'll be a lot of emails exchanged between this group, a lot more to talk about. Thank you all for your wonderful thoughts. Hopefully a little bit of inspiration there.